topic now. Today we're here to discuss a topic that's very important not only for Cuba but also for the rest of the world, and that is about resistance to imperialism and what is to be done next. So Cuba has long served as a symbol of the revolutionary spirit and resilience against the immense pressures of US imperialism and severe, deadly, and illegal economic sanctions and embargoes that have been placed on the small island nation for the past 6 decades and more. And as Noam Chomsky and Vijay Prashad wrote in a recent book on Cuba, we cannot think of another case in world history of a small country practically engulfed by the world's most powerful state, which is trying to destroy it, yet managing to survive, and not only survive, but succeed in many ways. So, आज हम बात करेंगे about the history of Cuban resistance as well as present क्या situation है, और फिर हम we'll also talk about the broader themes of global solidarity and the future of left, as well as connecting it to Pakistan and the global south, which obviously is also affected by the forces of imperialism and neoliberalism, which are present everywhere from Latin America to South Asia and everywhere in between. And we are very honored to have our honored guests here with us today. Really looking forward to hearing from them. So, sabse pehle, I would like to introduce His Excellency Zener Caro, the Ambassador of Cuba to Pakistan. And he has been working in Pakistan for some years now, and doing a lot of great work to maintain and strengthen diplomatic ties between Cuba and Pakistan. And we're very honored to have him with us today. And then next we have Professor Taimur Rahman, who is a professor of political science at LUMS here in Lahore. He is also the Secretary General of the left-wing Mazdoor Kisan Party, and he's also the lead guitarist of the band Lal. Yeah, so now that we've set the stage, I think we can get started on our conversation. I would like everyone in the audience to ask जो भी questions आपके पास हैं. मैं पहले शुरू कर देती हूँ 1-2 सवालों के साथ, और फिर आपके पास जो भी सवाल हो आप please ज़रूर पूछें. So first of all, maybe I could address a question to Your Excellency. Cuba has stood resilient for decades against US sanctions and continued to champion socialism despite immense challenges. Could you maybe start us off with a little crash course on the history of Cuba, of the revolution and Castro, and then and also of US imperialism in Cuba, and then maybe also tell us a bit about the present scenario and how Cuba is today continuing to sustain its resilience against all of these external pressures, especially in a global context where we see the resurgence of right-wing governments and neoliberal policies in many parts of the world. After uske baad maybe Prof. Rahman, you can connect it a bit more to Pakistan and to the global south and what we can also take away from all of this.
Okay, salam and good afternoon to everybody. I'm sorry to be late, but today I have had the craziest day in the last month. In fact, I just wake up in Delhi. I was in India in the morning, so I just came all the way from India to here to Lahore, thanks to our friend Amara Lijan, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you. Sorry if my voice sounds a little bit tired. But after a day of 7 hours in train from Delhi to Amritsar and then 2 hours to cross the border and everything, I'm a little bit tired. But again, it's my pleasure to be here. I will try to answer your question, and I would like to share with you like 3 or 4 main ideas on the history of the Cuban Revolution and our resistance against the imperialism. And I think that probably this micro is making some interference on that, isn't it? Well, yeah, I would like to, if we talk about the Cuban history, the Cuban Revolution history, that starts in 1959, and it's great to say that the Cuban Revolution is older than almost everyone here. We can just make a cut in 2 different periods. One first period that can go through all the real socialism in Europe period from 1959, the Cuban Revolution, to 1990, when the Soviet Union disappeared. During that first period, we have to endure, face a lot of threats from the US, starting with an invasion in 1961. Probably you have listened or read in history about the Bay of Pigs invasion to Cuba. It was an invasion that it was not launched directly by the US, but for a group of Cuban immigrants in the state that they use American training, American weapons, even American vessels to go into Cuba. And in 72 hours we defeated that invasion in 1961. That was probably the first big moment of Cuban collusion with the US. But then after that, we have during 1962, in 62, we have the famous missile crisis. What in Cuba we call it October crisis. It was a time when the Soviet Union, then Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union. He decided to put some missiles in Cuba. But we are too close to the US, and one spy airplane of the US just goes through the site where we were planning to just to deploy the missiles, and there was a huge crisis in the world. Never the world was so close to a new world war than in 1962. And during that crisis, our government, Fidel Castro was the leader of the Cuban Revolution at the time. We said, okay, we are ready to face whatever it takes. We are not afraid of anything. There was a declaration in Havana that has like 5 points, and one of the points was, okay, if for defending our independence, our sovereignty, our decision to have the Soviet missiles in Cuba, we have to face a nuclear war with the Americans, we will do it. Because our first priority, our top priority is our independence. So the crisis ends with an agreement between the Americans and the Soviet. The Soviet take away the missiles. The missiles were not in Cuba. We only have like 2 or 3 missiles, but they decided to stop the program, and the Americans stopped another similar program that they have in Turkey, or Turkey, as they say now. So it was an agreement between big powers. And we, the small island in the Caribbean, were just let aside. We learned from that time that, yeah, we have the threat of the American, but we also have to deal with the indifference of the other big power that was the Soviet Union. They support us. They gave us a lot of help. But in case of a crisis, in case of a paranoid invasion from the US, we will have to deal with our own forces. And that creates a mentality among Cubans on the necessity of being self-sufficient, of defend our sovereignty, and it reinforced the sense of nationalism that we had for more than 200 years, but it was stronger for that time because we were facing the biggest power in the world, the US, but we learned that the other big power, that was the Soviet Union, was on our side, but not as much as we want. Then during the 60s, we have a lot of internal turbulence in Cuba, most of them financed by the US. But due the situation in the world, the two powers, the two camps, the socialist camp and the capitalism camp, we were never alone. So we have the support of the Soviet Union. We have the embargo or the blockade, as we call it, from the US, the sanctions, the US sanctions that you have probably read about. They started 65 years ago. But during the first 20 years of the embargo, 25 years on the embargo, the consequences were not as hard because we have the trade with the Soviet Union and with the socialist camp. 90% of the Cuban trade from 1965 to 1990, 85% were with the Soviet Union and the socialist countries. So the embargo was there, and we were suffering from the embargo, but we have the support of the socialist countries to just balance our economy. And our economy went from a very bad situation in the 50s, before the revolution, to a point in the 80s, 85, 86, 87, when we have really high economical levels and really high human development levels. But then, you know what happened with the Berlin Wall, and you know what happened with the Soviet Union. Everything just disappeared. And from 1991, we start a new phase, a new period on our history of resilience, on our history of confrontation with the US. Because it was the moment when we have to start to deal with the US all by ourselves, alone. There was no socialist countries. There was not more socialist camp. There was no more Soviet Union. So it was in Latin America, in the Western hemisphere, there were Cuba alone against the US. And the US in the 90s was the superpower, the only superpower that were more conscious than ever that they were the only superpower. It was the time of the mentality of Fukuyama and the end of the history. It was the time when the Americans say, okay, we just won the Cold War. The history has ended. So now it's whatever we say is what should be done. And it was the hardest time of the Cuban Revolution till now, the 90s, 93, 94, 95, 96. because we lost the 85% of our trade. 85%. Try to imagine if Pakistan lost the 85% of your trade. We lost 85% of our trade. And we have to begin to deal with the sanctions by ourselves. We call it in Cuba we call it the periodo especial. It's like a special period, but it was a moment on our history. It was like, it takes like 5 to 6 years, where we were ready to deal with what we call it zero option. Zero option is we don't receive oil. So we don't produce oil in Cuba. We depend on the imports. So if we don't receive oil from abroad, if we don't receive food from abroad, we import like 50% of the food that we consume in Cuba. If we don't receive money from any international bank or whatever, what we can do? And we start to develop plans on what to do in that case. And we know, a single Cuban citizen at that time, we know, if there is an American invasion, I know at that time it was like 13, 14 years ago. I'm not that old. I remember that we know, my family know that if there is an invasion, my father was in the army, my father has to go to the war, and my family has to go to a place in the western side of Cuba, and we have to evacuate to that place. And in that place, we know the exact town that we have to go in case of a war. We know what we should do. My mother was a nurse at that time, so my mother was supposed to be working in this place, and I was 14 years old, I was supposed to be working in the agriculture in that place. Very local. So we have plans for the war, but also we have plans for the economy. What to do if we don't have oil. And that feeling of resilience, that sensation that we can do it, whatever happened, it helped us to overcome the worst moment in the Cuban history that was around 93 to 96, 98. It was also the time when we began to face the hardest side of the embargo. What is the embargo? I don't know if you have an idea that what is the embargo, but I can just summarize the embargo in 5 ideas. And first, we cannot use US dollars in any commercial transaction in the world. So if we want to buy, I don't know, Pakistani rice, and we have a Pakistani enterprise, we have to deal the way to pay the Pakistani enterprise in euros or in Chinese yuan, but we cannot use US dollars. If we pay to the Pakistan enterprise in US dollars and the US Treasury Department realize that we have done it, they can freeze that transaction, and we have lost a lot of money because of that. I remember once, I'm going to give you some examples. I was working on China. I spent most of my career working on China. And we have a trade fair in China. And we just hired a stand. It was 10,000 US dollars, only 10,000 US dollars. The person who was in charge of the stand just forgot about the embargo, and she sent the 10,000 US dollars to Cuba, to China. It has to go from Cuba to Germany, and from Germany to China, because we don't have at that time direct bank connection with China. When the Americans realized that the money was in China and in Germany, they freeze that money. 10,000 US dollars, that pocket money. So the US Treasury Department, they have an agency that is called OFAC, Office for the Control of Foreign Assets, that they have like 100 officials, and 90% of those officials are just in charge of Cuba, of pursuing every single Cuban transaction. And I just gave you an example of the payment of a commercial stand in a fair. They are just pursuing every single transaction. So, you know what happens if I have to pay to the Pakistani enterprises in euros, and I have to go through different banks. If I have to pay $1,000, when I go through 2 or 3 different banks, I'm paying $1,500. So all the products are more expensive. That's one. We cannot use US dollars. We cannot use, of course, any American or international banking, finance institution. We are out of IMF. We are out of the World Bank. So we cannot go through the mechanism. I don't know, Pakistan right now have problems, and you are just, the government is asking for a loan from the IMF, whatever. We cannot do even that, because we are out of the system. That's the second one. The third one, we cannot buy in the market any product that has more than 10% of American components. We cannot buy American products. Not a single American product. There are some exceptions, but for instance, another example, we were trying to buy airplanes from China for our agriculture. These airplanes that go through to the harvest and they fumigate the harvest. There was Chinese airplanes, but the Chinese at that time they don't produce the airplanes engines. So the Americans say, okay, the airplane is Chinese, but the engine is the 25% of the airplane, so you cannot buy it. You cannot buy a Chinese airplane because that Chinese airplane has a 25% of American components. I'm going to ask you right now, how many products in this world, especially heavy machinery that you need for the development of your economy, has not 10% of American components? A few. I can give you that as a homework. Try to just write down a list of products that don't have more than 10% of American components. Software, hardware, whatever. So it makes it really, really difficult to go to the market to find stuff. And you say, okay, you can go to China to buy stuff. Most of the Chinese biggest companies, they have a holder of American interest there, 20%, 25%, 15%. That's a third idea. A fourth idea is that we cannot buy anything in the US market. And when there are exceptions, and now there are exceptions in food, for instance, we have to pay in cash. As we cannot access any kind of loan, as we cannot access any kind of credit on the international banking system, and we cannot access the American banks, if we want to buy, and we're buying rice and we're buying chicken, overall chicken, from the American market, we have to pay in cash. And when you pay in cash, first you need the cash. And second one, when you have a commercial loan, probably the ton of chicken is going to cost you, I don't know, 1,500. But if you have to pay in cash, that is 2000, 2002, 2003. So it's more expensive when you're paying in cash. And the safety problems. And this is real. When we want to pay, when we want to buy chicken, we have to send a person with a suitcase with the money there. That's real. And some of you are smiling now. It's ridiculous. But it's the way the sanctions are working. So try to imagine if you want to buy, I don't know, probably 2, 3, 10 tons or 2 containers of chicken, that's not a lot of money. But still you need to go with the suitcase with the cash. It's the total paranoia of the American sanctions on Cuba. It's working in that way. And I'm giving you examples. And the fifth idea of the embargo is that the Americans cannot go into Cuba unless they have some kind of sanctions, some kind of license from the American government. Which is the country that is nearest to Cuba? US. If you are an American from the middle class and you want to go to the beach and you want to go to on summer, on holiday, where do you go? Cuba is like half an hour flight if you're coming from the south. Before the revolution, at that time there were more than 1 million Americans going into Cuba every year, 65 years ago. We have made some calculations that if the embargo was not there, if that kind of sanctions were not there, we were receiving 5 million American tourists every year in Cuba. So they are not only violating the rights of the American citizens in going into Cuba. They are not, the American government is not only violating the rights of their own citizens to go abroad. They are mainly limiting our capacity to receive the money that we can get from the American tourism. And you know that the American tourism is the one that spends more money abroad. So instead of receiving 5 million American tourists every year, we're receiving like 25,000, 30,000. And they have to go on the big licenses. And this one also has another side. If they want to buy, Cuban cigars are very, very famous. I don't like them, but they are very famous. They are the best in the world. When an American goes to Cuba, he cannot buy cigars. To buy cigars in Cuba, he needs a license from the US. And they say, okay, I'm a tourist and an American visitor in Cuba. I'm going to buy 2 boxes of, there is a limit in 1 box a month, no? or something like that. But okay, I want to buy 3 boxes because I want 1 box for my friend, for my father. When you go to the US customs, they say, no. But come on, it's just a box of cigars. No, that's Cuban. So, the embargo, and this is the main idea, it covers a diversity of measures that they come from the minimal issue like this of buying cigars or whatever to the higher levels of our economy. Everything that we just do in Cuba in economical terms has an impact of the American embargo. And I have given you some examples that probably are not the saddest, but I'm going to share with you 3 examples quite near to my person of how sad, of how terrible can be the U.S. sanctions, the impact of the U.S. sanctions on the Cuban people. Patients with cancer. We have, as every country, we have our own cancer situation. We have some cancers in Cuba that are developing in some high rates. This mama cancer or some child cancer, leukemia, for instance. Probably 95% of the medicines that you need to fight leukemia in child are sold by American companies. We cannot buy those medicines. I have a friend. Her daughter was like 6 years old. She developed a leukemia. She was treated in Cuba with our medicines and the medicine that we could get in the market. But she had a very severe leukemia. And we need a medicine that was only produced in the States. We cannot buy that medicine in the States. That child is dead. Because the American sanctions doesn't allow Cuba to buy that medicine. And that is happening with child with leukemia, but it's also happening with child with heart diseases. That you have to practice a surgery, an open chest surgery in a guy with in a 3 years old boy with a heart condition, and you need some medicines that they are only sold by biggest American companies. So what we do, or what we have done till now, we go to France. We just try to get it to France, but you can probably get medicine for 1 child, for 2, but not for 20 or for 30. So today, and during the last 65 years, and more specifically during the last 5 years, there are Cuban children dying because of the embargo. So that situation is terrible, and it's very, very, very close to the health and to the welfare of the Cuban people. And that's an idea of the embargo. And that's something that we are dealing with. When you just, and I hope that from today you can do it with more reasons. When you just think about the Cuban people resistance, just try to think that we are our resistance is not only against imperialism as something abstract. It's not only against the U.S. government because the American government is bad or Trump is crazy or whatever. Our fight is against a set of sanctions that, by the way, are laws in the U.S. are laws that can only be removed by the Congress, not even the president. The American president Obama, for instance, that was at some point was close to Cuba. He has not the right to say, okay, I'm going to end the embargo on Cuba. And I'm just going to enact a presidential statement and say, okay, the embargo is over. No. He has to go through the Congress. So, as we used to say in Cuba, the embargo was there 65 years ago, it's there today, and it's going to be there for a long time. So, and we have to deal with that. And during the last 30 years, we have learned to deal with the embargo mostly by ourselves. Mostly by ourselves. Of course, we have trade relations with China, with Russia, with Mexico, with Venezuela. We have had the support of a lot of countries, but mostly we depend on ourselves. And we are friends. The Cuban economy is like a roller coaster. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down, sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. And mostly because of the embargo, and mostly because of these sanctions, it's very hard to foresee when the Cuban economy will be smooth for a while. I remember that we had a very good period, 2015, 16, 17, 18. We were in this side of the roller coaster. But you all remember what happened in 2018? That this guy with the bad hair and everything, Mr. Trump. And Trump was president of the U.S. for 4 years. 4 years is 208 weeks. Trump Trump approved new measures for the new sanctions against Cuba. As I was telling you, he was president for 208 weeks. Well, he approved 254 new measures, new sanctions against Cuba. Every week, more than one. Every week, more than one. And sanctions are as hard as, for instance, if a company, if we are buying oil, for instance, from Russia, the American were monitoring the ships that were going from Russia to Cuba, to bring that oil, and every time that a ship, a vessel, just touched Cuban ports, it was sanctioned. And when they sanction a ship, a trade ship, that ship cannot go to American ports. So if you want to sell something to Cuba, you have to be sure that the ships, that the vessels that you are going to use are only for Cuba. You cannot send it to the States. And just try to think in a map. What is logical is, okay, I'm going to sell, I don't know, sugar to Cuba. So I'm going to sell a ship to Cuba. This ship is going to be empty here. I'm going to send it to the States. That is 90 miles. And I'm going to load my ship here and then send it back. No. If your ship going to Cuba, your ship cannot go into the US for a year at the beginning and not for 2 years. So what is happening is that most of the goods that we are getting are being sent to Jamaica, and then we have to use our own ships to go to Jamaica to bring that stuff into Cuba. So when one ship costs you, before that cost you, I don't know, $1,100 US, now it's costing you double, because you have to pay a second ship and you have to pay all the insurance and everything that it's. So it's cruel. It's affecting everything in Cuba, everything in the Cuban life, and it's affecting also our partners. The doctor was in Venezuela right now. You were in Venezuela like 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago.
Yes.
Venezuela is suffering for almost the same set of sanctions.
Yes.
And one of the reasons, besides the oil, is the support to Cuba. They support Cuba, so you need sanctions. And there is not a single country that is out of the sanctions, because sometimes you probably have heard, but that's a bilateral problem between Cuba and the US. That's between them. No. And I've been suffering the embargo here in Pakistan, because I've tried to open an account, a bank account, for my use, to buy stuff in Daraf. I don't know. I cannot open a bank account here. You know why? Because Trump decided to include Cuba in something that they call the list of the state that sponsor terrorism. That's a list of the State Department. As Cuba is in that list, we cannot have commercial and financial interaction with a lot of banks. If I go to a bank here, I say, okay, I want to send $300 to my parents in Havana. The guy in the bank is going to say, okay, give me your passport. He's going to write down my name. He's going to type my name, and then he's going to type Cuba. And when he just typed Cuba, there's going to be a red alert here saying, Cuba is in the list of a state who sponsor terrorism. You cannot deal with a transaction of this person. And I just want to open an account to buy stuff in their ass. I'm not sending medicines to Cuba. I just want to buy stuff for myself. I cannot do it. And that's happening in every single country. So the embargo, I'm going to finish this idea with it, is affecting everything in Cuba, but it's affecting every single country in the world, because it has implications beyond Cuba. And we are dealing with that. And now I'm going to the second side, and this is going to be shorter. No matter of all these sanctions, no matter of all the problems that we have had and that we still have with our economy, Cuba has a history of solidarity, yes, a history of cooperation that it really makes us proud. I'm not going to say that we are the country that is the more solidarity in the world, or we are the an example or whatever, because it's not the way that we see it. But I have to tell you that we have a history of solidarity that we are proud of. And that history, thank you. That history starts with, in the first days of the Cuban Revolution, and it covered a range of 65 years. For instance, we, at the very beginning of the revolution, we sent help support to the Algerian Revolution. Yes. You remember that the Algerian Revolution was one of the first revolutions in Africa, in the northern Africa, and at that time President Boumediene asked for support from Cuba. 1963, the revolution has only 4 years, and we sent doctors, we sent teachers, but we sent soldiers. When Israel is a bad word, but anyway, when Israel attacked during the War of the Sixth Day, the confrontation with the Arab countries, you know why Israel did not take all the Golan Heights? You know where the Golan Heights are in Syria. Israel, during that war, Israel only took one side of the Golan Heights, where the other side remains in Syria. It was because of the Cuban troops that were there. And that's the reality. So we sent troops, and we were like a detente for the Israelis. They say, okay, we're not going to fight with the Cubans. We have a history in Africa, in Angola, in Congo with Che Guevara. Probably you have all known about that, but Che Guevara was more on his own. But we have a history on support the liberation struggles of the peoples in Africa, both Congos, Congo Kinshasa and Congo Brazzaville, but also Mozambique, but also Zimbabwe, and the most Angola, and the most important one, that is Namibia. Because if you remember history, Namibia was not a country, it was a province, a colony of the South Africa. Yes. And when the Cuban troops and the Angolan troops, when we defeat the South African army in Angola, they just retreat to South Africa, and that facilitates the independence of Namibia. And that facilitates the ends of apartheid. And that facilitates the liberation of Mandela. And Mandela has always remembered that because of the struggle of his people first, because of his own struggle in second term, but also because of the support of the Cuban troops in Angola, the liberation of Namibia was possible and the end of the apartheid was possible. That's a history, but all these examples are before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So at that time we have support, no? After that, and during the last 30 years, our history of solidarity and support to other countries has gone mainly through medical teams, medical support, medical assistance. And here in Pakistan, we have a huge example. It was in 2005 after the Kashmir earthquake, where we sent the biggest medical team that was here in Kashmir at that time. We sent 2,600 medical and paramedical staff. I was one of them. I was with the medical team at that time. And it's till today is still our biggest international cooperation, solidarity mission abroad, medical mission abroad that we have here in Pakistan for more than 8 months, where we attend like 2 million Pakistanis, and we saved the life of more than 1,100 Pakistanis in Kashmir and in WFP. At that time it wasn't WFP, now it's KPK. That's an example. But during COVID, for instance, we sent like more than 20 medical teams abroad to fight COVID in countries like probably, if I ask you, you're not going to guess. Yeah, you can say, okay, Cuba sent medical teams to fight COVID abroad. And they probably send it only to Africa or only to Latin America. We sent teams to Italy. We sent teams to Portugal. We sent teams to the developed countries. And in Italy, we sent 4 teams to fight COVID in the places where the Italian doctors didn't want to fight COVID. That was a reality. And during the Ebola situation in Africa, probably remember that was before COVID, we also sent medical teams to Liberia, the other countries I can remember, Liberia and the other 2 countries I can remember right now. But we sent medical teams to 3 places where the Ebola was peaking, and nobody wanted to send doctors there, and we sent doctors there. So mostly, and besides of the crisis, besides of the embargo, we are still fulfilling what we consider that is the main reason of our foreign policy, the main reason of our existence as a nation of the global south, that is to support in any condition, whatever happened, the countries of the global south. But we were talking, and somebody just told me that it's sometimes it's hard to understand why, if we have such a difficult situation, economic situation like we have right now, we are still sending doctors abroad. And other people just ask me, why don't you use that money that you are used to send doctors to Italy in your own economic development? Instead of spend $1 million sending doctors to Africa, that is so far from you, use that $1 million in your own economy. If the world, if every country in the world decide to do that, to use their own money to their own necessities and forget about the world, probably in like 100 years there will be no human beings. Our priority, the top priority, if I have to resume the Cuban foreign policy in 3 words, I will tell you is cooperation, solidarity, and peace. And we don't care about ideology. When we came here in 2005, we don't have an embassy here. And Musharraf was the one who wasn't here. But when he asked for our support, we didn't ask, is this a military dictatorship? He's from the right? He's a friend of America? We didn't ask. He just said, we have a huge earthquake here. Nobody's coming. Can you help us? And yes, we went there. And we spent 8 months there. And we never asked about politics. Never. And if you have friends or families living in Kashmir or in KPK, you can ask them. If they were there at that time, you can ask them. Were the Cuban doctors going to any political meeting? Were the Cuban doctors talking about ideology? Were they just trying to convince the Pakistani people in Kashmir or in KPK about socialism? No. It's not an idea. They were saving lives. And when we finished there, we just took our stuff. We donate a lot of stuff, but we took our stuff and just go home. And from that time, the only person that has come back to Pakistan is me now as an ambassador. We don't care about ideology. When the matter is cooperation, we don't care about ideology, and this is very important. And it's very important overall in Latin America. And I'm going to finish with this because it's probably give you a way. It's very important overall in Latin America. That is our region. When Latin America is also like a roller coaster. The political cycles in Latin America are very short. And sometimes you have a country, like Chile, for instance, that has 4 years a far-right government, 4 years a very leftist government, and then again a right government, and then the left. The diversity of the left and the diversity of the right is more homogeneous, but the diversity of the left governments in Latin America sometimes makes it difficult to get political consensus on everything. If we are only going to cooperate, if we're only going to send medical teams or teachers or whatever to the countries that we believe that are real in the left side on the history, on the left side of it, we are not doing anything. We are not doing anything. Right now, for instance, we have doctors, and probably I'm going to use it a little for a moment, which is probably the most right-wing government in Central America, which is El Salvador. You have Nayib Bukele there. Nayib Bukele is the president of El Salvador. He's a populist, but he's far right-wing.
More than Argentina?
No, I'm talking Central America. No, Milei is another stuff. This guy from El Salvador, Central America, he's the far right-wing representative in Central America. We have right now 250 doctors in El Salvador with Bukele. We don't care. They have lives to save there. And Bukele, that is far right, that is against Venezuela and is against everything that just smells like socialism or communism or whatever, has never stood against Cuba. Never. That's foreign policy. But overall, that's the way to go and help people. We have, I'm going to finish with this example. We have, at some point, we have more than 3,000 doctors in Brazil. It was Lula was at power. And it started with Lula and then was Dilma. But then it was a change. It was there was a new government in Brazil from this Bolsonaro guy that is the Brazilian Trump or the Brazilian Milei. And one of his first foreign policy decisions was to cut the program of Cuban solidarity in Brazil. The Cuban medical, the program was called Más Médicos, more doctors. And he said, okay, I don't want Cubans here. Please send your doctors back. Our first reaction was not, okay, we're taking them back. Was, okay, and this is among friends. We sent a delegation to talk to him and tell him, okay, we don't care about your policy, but we don't have problem letting our doctors there. Our doctors are in places where your doctors are not going. If you take out our doctors, you're not taking out the ideology. You are taking out the only real health care that your people can have. But he said, no, take it out, communists out. And we take them out. He lost his election to Lula, a Monday, for instance. And on Wednesday, even before, like 2 or 3 months ago, before Lula assumed the presidency, we sent a delegation to Lula and say, okay, you remember the 3,000 doctors that were here, that this Bolsonaro take them away? We are ready to send them back. They are already in Brazil. It's a matter of principles. It's principles. And here in Pakistan it's the same. We send doctors with Musharraf, but when we receive 965 Pakistani young people to study medicine in Cuba, it was, I think it was Nawaz Sharif government. So the idea started with Musharraf, and then it came all the story that you know, and then came Nawaz Sharif. And we don't say, no. We were talking with Musharraf, we don't want to talk with you. No. We just say, okay, we have this problem, and we just went to Sharif government. I said, we have this problem. We started with Musharraf. It was an idea with Musharraf, but it's still here. Do you want it or not? And Sharif said, okay, let's do it. That program lasts 7 years. In 7 years, you know how many governments Pakistan can have. So we start dealing with Musharraf program, then we go with Nawaz, then we go with the
People's Party. Nawaz.
People's Party, yeah. So your current president, Sardari. We don't make difference. But what we want was to have 965 Pakistani doctors graduated from Cuba. And when we realized there were any kind of problem, we said, forget about policy, forget about ideology. We don't care. PPP, PPP, PML, PTI. Well, I care about this, by the way. We don't care. What we want is to get our cooperation programs to the end. And now we are proud to say that here in Pakistan, we have 965 doctors that were graduated in Cuba. And right now, some of them, like 600 of them, are not here, are working abroad. But this is the last thing that I'm going to say. Last year, 2022, 2023, I was dealing with a bad disease, really bad. I had cancer like 2 years ago. I went to a hospital, and the second time that I went to the hospital just to run some tests and everything, there was a doctor sit there. It was a woman. I just saw her looking at me and trying to listen to my conversation. I said, oh, what's the idea? I just sit, and she asked me in perfect Spanish, are you from Cuba? I said, oh, yeah. You were talking in Spanish? Yeah. How do you know it? I was graduated in Cuba. So the doctor who takes care of my health was graduated in Cuba. That's the only prize that we want. We don't want recognition, we don't want medals, or we don't want these shields. We don't care about that. Our satisfaction in Pakistan, for instance, that's what I am right now, is that doctor that was with the team who saved my life. Or the 10 doctors that during the floods of 2 years ago, they went to the hardest places. They just left the hospitals here. They asked for a 2 weeks, 3 weeks exemption, and they were there. And they were dealing with the people in the flood areas in KPK and in Kashmir. And one of them sent me a picture that is being one of my biggest reasons of happiness here in Pakistan. They were dealing with patients in a tent, in a place in KPK that I can't remember right now. And besides him, in his tent, there was a Cuban flag for me and for Cuba. That's all we need, all we want, all we have been fighting for. I think, I don't know, I just used like half an hour. Sorry. I'm ready to answer any question, but please, and I have to say this. I asked him not to do me any kind of singing.